I'm not going to beat around the bush on this one, Far Cry New Dawn is not great. Much like its predecessor from last year, it really does feel like we've done this song and dance too many times. Hell, even taken on its own merits, New Dawn features a number of questionable design choices that hamstring the entire experience. Far Cry New Dawn takes place 17 years after the monumentally silly ending of Far Cry 5, so minor spoilers ahead, I guess. A nuclear exchange has laid waste to modern society, giving rise to new settlements of survivors, but also roving gangs of bandits. One such gang, inventively named the Highwaymen, runs rampant across Hope County, Montana, and as part of a group dedicated to helping settlements find their footing in the new world, it's up to the player to fend them off. The narrative is pretty standard as far as post-apocalyptic fiction and Far Cry games are both concerned. You have the standard Far Cry setup of being stranded in hostile territory under the control of a charismatic antagonist, except this time it's two kind of forgettable antagonists, and the setting is the same hostile territory as the last game, but with a vibrant coat of Rad Max post-apocalyptic paint on top. Beyond that, you've got typical post-apocalyptic elements such as raiders and survivor settlements and tech that's been MacGyvered together from pieces of random junk, but I'm not really sure it adds all that much. Despite the setup, Hope County doesn't feel like it survived a nuclear exchange, partly due to the overall presentation, which I'll touch on later, and partly thanks to so few people talking about the event itself or its aftermath. It's so unclear that there actually was an apocalypse beyond the aesthetic lip service that the game pays to the concept, and because of this I found it hard to actually get into the game's narrative. It also doesn't help that New Dawn's primary antagonists feel pretty flat, especially when compared to their peers. The twins might be the most forgettable Far Cry villains to date for a number of reasons. Their basic power-hungry motivations leave them feeling one-dimensional, and they feel incredibly overexposed. During play you'll hear them raging over the radio whenever you complete a mission, and they show up in the odd cutscene to remind you that they still exist, but although they beat a dude to death in front of you and threaten to blow up some kids, they ultimately feel toothless. That's not great, because as far as plot-relevant characters go, Mickey and Lou are as memorable as Far Cry New Dawn gets. Now don't get me wrong, there are some neat buddies you can have along for your adventure, like Nana the geriatric sniper, but in terms of plot relevance, everyone's super boring. This isn't helped along by the voice acting, which, while serviceable, just doesn't deliver any exciting performances. Even Joseph Seed, the antagonist of the prior game, just doesn't sound as interested as he previously did, and his charisma was the only thing that kept that character engaging. New Dawn doesn't feel like a complete step backwards, however. Hope County may be the same setting as we got in 5, but it does benefit from a liberal dash of colour in the form of vibrant pink and blue flowers. That said, despite littering the map with rundown strongholds and settlements made of junk, everything feels too neat for it to be a true post-apocalypse. It feels like it's artificially apocalyptic, lacking any real end-of-the-world charm. I will say that I like the visual design of a lot of the game's weapons though. Old firearms retrofitted with junk in lieu of actual weapon attachments is charming, but the lackluster reskinning of the animals found in Far Cry 5 leaves me feeling on the fence with regards to the game's overall look. Really, despite the setting looking far more interesting than it was in 5, and despite featuring elements that should scream post-apocalypse, the game just doesn't feel post-apocalyptic. My time in New Dawn's Hope County felt pretty much the same as my time in 5's Hope County, and that feels weird and wrong. I can't say I feel too great about Far Cry New Dawn's gameplay side either. While the core shooting and stealth mechanics are functional, they're kneecapped by the game's reliance on and poor implementation of level up difficulty. That is, artificial challenge that can only be effectively overcome by increasing your in-game power, not by changing your approach or increasing your personal skill level. Now, while some games can use this approach to great effect, New Dawn implements it in such a way that you find your weapons and abilities are obsolete before you even get a chance to really sink your teeth into them. The game's enemies and animals will all have a challenge rating from 1 to 4, and if your weapons or takedown abilities aren't of the corresponding level, then you are in for an uphill battle. Far Cry 5 had the issue of armored enemies acting as bullet sponges, but this approach turns every enemy into one until you grind out more upgrades. And this really does feel like a grind. As with Far Cry 5, there's no crafting-based upgrades with regards to your actual character, instead needing arbitrarily high amounts of perk tokens to get better takedowns or more weapon slots. Hell, even the binoculars that have come standard with every Far Cry game since at least 2 has to be bought with these tokens. In terms of crafting upgrades, you have to gather resources from around the map to build up your stronghold and in turn, craft better weapons. Initially, this feels like less of a grind than the perk tokens, but eventually the crafting costs become so large that you'll find yourself scouring locations you've already passed through once or twice because your weapons no longer cut it. Now, the absolute cynic in me points at the Far Cry coins and resources that can be bought with real-world money as the driving force behind New Dawn's overall grind and artificial difficulty, which is shady as hell. I shouldn't have to pay more money for your games to feel better balanced, Ubisoft. Get your shit together. It's a real shame that Far Cry New Dawn's core gameplay loop feels like an endless grind because, once again, the mechanics themselves feel good, as long as you aren't trying to take on anyone even a single level higher than your weapons or skills allow. Shooting feels responsive, you have a good variety of weapons on hand to keep things interesting, and player movement is about as tight as it ever was before. The game even gives you a sweet buzzsaw launcher, but unfortunately it's about the only thing in the game that is uniquely New Dawn. The game's stealth mechanics are also pretty much mostly fine, though enemies have a bad habit of being alerted when they have zero reason to be, and this is a holdover issue from Far Cry 5. My main issue is that both of these aspects are so entangled in New Dawn's upgrade system that it's difficult to just play and enjoy these parts of the game without eventually hitting a roadblock that causes you to grind out some new gear or skills. I suppose one of the other reasons for the grind is that there just isn't a lot to do in New Dawn. You have all of the usual Ubisoft busy work to do, with convoys, strongholds, and hunting grounds littering the map, but in terms of actual focused narrative missions, there's maybe 20 all up. There are expeditions which give you a glimpse of the US outside of Hope County, but these just end up being larger variations on strongholds, with a little more replay value thanks to some randomized elements. All in all, if you take out the amount of expeditions and strongholds that I had to grind, I'd say New Dawn has about 5 hours worth of actual gameplay, and that's probably being generous. With that all said, Far Cry New Dawn is bad. As I said with Far Cry 5, if New Dawn was my first Far Cry game, I'd probably look a little more kindly on its shortcomings, but even taken on its own merits, the game is poorly designed. The competent shooting and stealth mechanics are mired in skill tree and artificial difficulty bullshit that leaves the game feeling less challenging and more like a chore. And when you do take the game's place in the series into account, it simply feels like a poor man's version of everything that came before.